Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. The webinar is about to begin. Today we have Anticlimax, the book by Sheila Jeffries, discussed by Laura Lecuona and Sheila Jeffries.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thank you, Joe, for the presentation. Yes, in fact, today I'm delighted to speak with Sheila Jeffries about her second book, Anticlimax, A Feminist Perspective on the Sexual Revolution, which was originally published in 1990 by the Women's Press and has a more recent edition published by Spinifex Press with a new preface in 2011. Even though it was Sheila Jeffries' second book and it was written more than 30 years ago, several issues we can read about in her more recent writings are already there, forming a strong root of a very important radical feminist body of work, encompassing 11 more books, including Penal Imperialism, which will come out in September, next September. But not only that, Anticlimax is as relevant now as it was in 1990. In her 2011 preface, Sheila Jeffries wrote, "I wrote Anticlimax in the late 1980s, when it still seemed possible that the way people were having sex could change. Sexual pleasure and practice under male domination, I argued, were constructed around the eroticizing of women's subordination, and I hoped that this would be undermined as a result of the influence of second-wave feminism and women's increasing opportunities. However, in the book, I expressed my growing concern that a developing pornography industry and a backlash within feminism itself, which supported the status quo, posed a serious challenge to the possibility of eroticizing equality. But I still hoped that progress would be made. As I write this preface in 2011, it is very clear that the opposite took place." End of quote. And what to say about 2022? Things are so much worse today in that regard. And for the same reason, Anticlimax and its exemplary feminist analysis is more necessary still. By the way, if somebody still doesn't quite understand why radical feminists say sexuality is a social construct, this book provides the best explanation, along with wonderful examples of sexologists and counselors devoted to the task. I'm sure most of the women here today must have read at least one of your books, Sheila, and are familiarized with your style of writing. As the ideas you convey are of so much consequence, one can spend hours discussing them and forget the specific way they are conveyed, the form instead of the content. But I want to take this opportunity to say how enjoyable it is reading you, even when the matters you deal with are everything but. I love your subtle irony, your rationality, your clarity, the way you take the argument of the opponent and lay bare all their assumptions and implications. You don't mince words. And one simple sentence of yours may carry tons of meaning. I would like to give a few examples, if I may, of your characteristic tongue-in-cheek categorical sentences. From chapter 1 of Anticlimax, the 1950s, that's how it's called, this first chapter, Sheila Jeffries says, "Many women seemed unable to appreciate the aesthetic attractions of the penis." Or from chapter 2, the censorship, "Whatever William Burroughs was liberating with his pornographic novel, The Naked Lunch, it wasn't sex. And he seems to have been about as anti-sex as it would be possible to get. Like many of the supposed sexual liberators of the 1960s and 70s, he seems to have been unable to associate sex with anything but lavatories, shit, death, or disease." From chapter 3, The Sexual Revolution, "Women must learn what turns their men on and provide the appropriate stimulus. This is the sexual revolution." From that same chapter, another quote, that women in the 1950s should get so enmeshed in hetero reality that they are unable to envisage love or happiness for themselves without being able to serve men and children should not astonish us when we take into account the fact that many heterosexual women who see themselves as feminists today have a similar problem. Remember, this was written in 1990. Or writing about a women's magazine and the letters section through which women gave each other tips on how to make their situation bearable. They advised each other on how to swallow semen in the same way in which they would advise each other on how to remove red wine stains from the carpet in another kind of women's magazine. Fellatio was a new kind of housework. From chapter 4, The Failure of Gay Liberation, male transsexuals really do believe that they carry within themselves some kind of essence of womanhood. And the next quotes are more serious, but they are a good example of the simplicity and forcefulness of Sheila Jeffries' writing. From chapter 5, Feminism and Sexuality, women have been lured into accepting a substitute for their liberation, which is designed to ensure that they cannot achieve liberation. And from chapter 6, Creating the Sexual Future, Sheila says, if we cannot imagine our liberation, then we cannot achieve it. As you are right here with us, Sheila Jeffries, would you like to tell us why did you write the book and what did you want to achieve in writing it? You're muted, you're muted.
Thanks, Laura, for saying all of that about the book, which is great. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here, sisters. Now, Anticlimax was my second book. And of course, the title refers to the fact that the so-called sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s was an anticlimax for women. I actually think it's the best title of any of my books. I quite like it because one word is always good for a book title. Instead of achieving any kind of liberation, I argued, women were recruited into a more intense servicing of the male sex right. The industries that service the male demand, pornography, prostitution, were opened up, and men's fetish interests were served with the liberation of sadomasochism, now called BDSM, which was normalized and promoted as everyday sex. Now, in my first book, which was The Splinter and Frenemies in 1985, which I talked about on a previous webinar, I looked at feminist campaigns and ideas in the late 19th and early 20th century, which sought to transform male sexuality, sought to raise the age of consent to protect girls, criminalize incest, and end men's prostitution, abuse of women. And I showed that there was a huge backlash in the 1920s against those feminists, in which sexologists, scientists of sex, and their popularizers argued that women had to be penetrated, and if they accepted being penetrated with the penis, then that would solve the feminism, solve lesbianism, solve all the threats that male dominance was suffering from this huge feminist wave at the time. And women, if they managed to get a sexual pleasure out of penis in vagina sex, would they would love their oppression. They were very, very worried that huge numbers of women were not doing sexual intercourse or refused to be pleased by it, and so on. So it became the huge problem of the 20th century, how to make women do PIV sex and how to have orgasms of their oppression, to their oppression. And in Anticlimax, what I tried to do was strengthen my argument that sex under male domination is constructed to be the eroticizing of women's subordination. And let me just show a little quote about this. So this is what one of the things that I argued in the book, the fundamental bit of the book, really, the sexiness of inequality, it became clear, was the unacknowledged motor force of male supremacy. Through sexual fantasy, men were able to reinforce the sense of their power and of women's inferiority daily and be rewarded for every thought and image of women subordinated with sexual pleasure, a pleasure acknowledged to be the most valuable form of pleasure in male supremacist culture. And the thing was, of course, that there was very little pornography at the time compared with the huge industry we have now. But what pornography was useful for, and I was in the first book in Britain the first group in Britain to oppose pornography in the late 1970s. What pornography did was it gave us a roadmap to male sexuality and how they felt about women. We were really able to see it and analyze it. So horrifying though it is, pornography actually is very useful in that way. And it shows us what underpins, the powerful underpinning of men's excitement at the subordination of women. But Anticlimax doesn't just show the campaign to liberate men's sexual access to women continuing, which it does. For instance, I talk about books like The Joy of Sex, which taught women that they must accept being dressed in rubber and being gagged and so on. And also it says in that book that women had to love swallowing semen because they needed to think of it as being like cut grass. So instead of women being disgusted, they had to think as they swallowed semen, this is like cut grass, it tastes like cut grass, it smells like cut grass and so on. So apologies to any of you out there who have found it difficult to actually actualize this instruction and still find it absolutely disgusting. Now, the book comes from a different time, of course, as was Laura pointed out. When I wrote it, I still thought there was a chance that we would create change and that we would change sex, which very clearly wasn't true. So I wrote the book because I needed to show what happened to our feminist challenge to male violence, pornography, and so on, because in the mid-80s, there was something called the Feminist Sex Wars. Those of us who'd been fighting pornography and thought we could be successful because some changes were happening, like pornographic ads were removed from London Underground trains, for instance, because we fought that. And we thought we could have change in the mid-80s. Indeed, you know, even for a few more years. But a feminist campaign against us began with the promotion of sadomasochism, with the development of something called lesbian pornography, with the defense of pornography, with whole organizations set up to promote pornography. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. So the book was trying to say, look, we had all of this, and look what happened to it.
Yeah, amazing. It's so bad this backlash came in. I know you didn't change the course of events. We all know. Imagine if you could have. And you couldn't counteract, of course, the enormous influence the sexual liberals had on what happened with feminism from the 80s or 90s onward. But right now, maybe it is a good time to reignite the flame of radical feminism. Many young feminists are aware of what is at stake, and it's fantastic that they can read this book now and have your enormous clarity to guide them on their activism and show them a way. Gender hurts, on the other hand, and by the way, it's true that Anticlimax is a very good title, but in general, your titles are to the point. They are very good titles. But Gender Hurts was ahead of its time. You have said about it that when it was published, the public was perhaps not so well prepared to receive it, meaning its issues weren't then so apparent as they are today. So not many people commented on it back then. How was the reception of Anticlimax when it was first published?
Well, that was very different. When Anticlimax was published, it was very well received. We need to think of a different time here. There were still feminist publishers, feminist bookshops, feminist magazines, and a radical feminist book was, you know, very well received. It was seen as a sensation. It was waited for. There was a lot of enthusiasm. Terribly different from the situation now, of course. But there was a difficulty getting it published. I sent the manuscript to the publisher of my first book, Pandora Press, who did The Spinster and Her Enemies, because I thought they might like my second book, but they didn't. Philippa Brewster from the press wrote to me saying that she agreed with 70% of the book, but the rest leaves me gasping but numb, paralyzed. I am not happy being turned to stone. Fortunately, I was able to go to the women's press. Imagine, we had women's presses in those days, and they were happy to publish it. I launched the book at the University Women's Club and at the Reeves Hotel in Shepherd's Bush, which was the only London women's hotel where a 60s disco took place. I mean, imagine having a women's hotel now. I did many other talks, including on a mainstream TV chat show in Dublin, and there was a piece about the book in The Guardian, and a positive 2-page review in Rouge, which was a lesbian and gay socialist journal. Anticlimax was reviewed positively in lots of other feminist and gay outlets. But there were detractors. Obviously, there were also people who hated the book. There was a nasty review by a man who called me a Jesuit of the feminist movement and said my book was evil Knievel stuff, so crazy it elicits a mad cheer. So I'm very pleased that he really didn't like it. He was a friend of William Burroughs, apparently, that man. Gillian Rogerson in Gay Times in May 1990 was very cross about the book, saying it was a smug, nasty apology for the type of exclusive lesbian separatism which is tearing the feminist movement apart. But it made an impact at that time. And so it's very difficult to understand why today there's no feminist critique of sexual practice or the construction of sexuality at all. Complete desert for any kind of critical discussion of sexuality when we consider that it really was happening back then.
Yeah. Today we don't have even that. Even if it's to critique it, we need this discussion. Let's see what happens when penile imperialism comes out. I'm sure a lot of people will be very mad at you. But well, let me tell you about this Philippa Brewster stance. As an editor myself, I can not agree with her at all. You don't have to agree 100% with a book in order to publish it. She could see it was important, but I understand why she was paralyzed. Your ideas are very revolutionary indeed, and your questioning runs very, very deep. It touches personal and intimate issues. It's impossible to remain indifferent. But how important that it was published finally, and I am very happy that thanks to Spinifex, it is still circulating and we can still be reading it, and we can still read it. Your books, Sheila, form a very consistent corpus of theory, and they don't lose relevance with time. Even I know you would like them to lose relevance. We all would like to, but no, on the contrary, some of them are, some of your writings from decades ago are even more relevant today. And what you say, what you have said proves to have been true and to the point right from the start. And I wonder, in these almost 40 years of continued writing and thinking, have you changed your mind about some weighty issue?
I can't think of an issue on which I've changed my mind. I know it's supposed to show that, we're open to all possibilities and ideas, but actually I can't think of anything that I disagree about. But some things have become clearer to me now than they were then. For instance, I didn't know when I wrote the book. I've got a big section in there on transgenderism, called transsexualism at the time. And at the time, I thought it was something that particularly gay men were into. I didn't understand that it was mainly about heterosexual men. So I got that wrong in the book. Now we do know that. So that's a simple factual issue. But otherwise, my understanding of the history and politics of sexuality has been consistent since my first book. And what I've always thought to do is to understand and end men's sexual violence against women and girls by working out how it is constructed.
And you have given very plausible explanations for that violence and have worked passionately towards ending it. It's a huge task for feminism, but without your work and that of other radical feminists, it would be nearly impossible. We couldn't even imagine it. And you certainly show us a way and help us imagine the liberation of women. In Anticlimax, you remember how the censorship of some pornographic novels as The Naked Lunch or Lolita was instrumental for the growth of the porn industry. You extend the term pornography to describe not only videos or photographs, but novels which portray the sexual humiliation of women. In 2022, I'd like to ask you, is a censorship program which abolished this kind of content, but preserved free speech for example, feminists who are now accused of hate crime, feasible? Would this program be feasible? There's a widely accepted argument for free speech, which claims that if one wants their free speech to be upheld, they have to accept the free speech of their opponents. I know you criticize this free speech of absolutism, so to say, but could you please elaborate? As a radical feminist, of course, I strongly oppose pornography, as do you, but I also worry about the attacks towards radical feminists and dissenters in other politically charged areas as well. Is it possible to reconcile these positions?
Yes, I am also worried that some feminists are sort of leaping into a free speech position because the arguments of free speech are very problematic for feminists. I define as pornography both written and visual material which humiliates women for men's sexual excitement. And that was the definition we had in 1977 when we sent up the London Revolutionary Feminist Anti-Pornography Group, and it's still the one I have. I explained that before the porn industry could be launched, the laws that forbade certain books by men had to be de-censored. Both those, the books that you mentioned, Naked Lunch and Lolita, are horrific in their violence towards women and children. And it was a shock to me in rereading it, because I haven't read this book for a very long time. And I was totally shocked by the violence. I had to reread again. There were court cases about these books and others in order to de-censor and allow men to start writing and doing whatever they wanted. And the publishers said the books were of literary merit, and from then on, anything could be published. But porn then and now was defended as free speech. The argument of the lawyers was that if speech was free, this would create a level playing field for the play of ideas. But there could be no level playing field. Men controlled publishing and the organized crime that created pornography in its visual form and still does. And women were in no position to object to any of this. We did not want to create an industry in which men were humiliated for women's delight, because this is not women's sexuality, because we are the underclass. And we had no power to do that. I mean, people would say, well, create your own porn industry. Why on earth would we do that? Because pornography is a signal of the men's oppression of women. It's not something we could do. So the lack of free speech for women is very clear right now. Activists for so-called transgender rights can say anything they like about women. They do death threats and rape threats if we criticize their behavior. Feminists are visited by the police, hauled before the courts, lose our jobs and livelihoods. It wasn't as bad as that back in the day. There's no freedom of speech here for women. So free speech basically means men's speech. For instance, now we even have the word woman removed from us by transgender rights, supposedly activists. Women are being threatened into silence. Now, I think the problem is, though, that it's sometimes tactically useful to use free speech arguments because many male liberals will be reached by this. But it is problematic. The Australian feminist Betty McClellan, in her book Unspeakable, also published by Spinifex Press, argues that what we need is fair speech rather than free speech. I mean, we could indeed have a whole discussion of this, so I think I'll leave it there for now, but we need to be talking about speech and feminism for sure.
Yes, yes. And thank you for your answer for this recommendation. I will look for Betty McClellan's book. I'm very interested in the topic. And regarding the place which pedophilia has had in the gay liberation movement, Sheila, one would think gay activists would be very vocal against such a stain in their reputation. I have the impression that in the decades after you wrote Anticlimax, there was some backlash against the pedophile element in the gay movement, although they seem to be coming back with a vengeance, now called minor attracted persons or something like that. But is this impression correct, that there was some backlash? Perhaps the church sexual abuse scandals had to do with it. Perhaps gay men had to strategically separate themselves from the pedophiles in order to gain social acceptance for gay adoptions, the gay adoption and surrogacy. What has changed with regard to the pedophile presence in the gay liberation movement from 1990 to 2022.
Yes, well, I've got a whole chapter on the paedophile liberation movement in the new book, Penile Imperialism. So I have done a little bit of work on working out how it's changed and what's happened. When rereading my section in Anticlimax for this webinar, I was shocked all over again at the progress that was made towards normalizing men's sexual abuse of children in the 70s and 80s. Because at that time, this use of children was being promoted by many gay men's organizations, all of whom sought to reduce or abolish the age of consent so the men could get at the children. It was very blatant. The main organization, Paedophile Information Exchange, or PI, was supported by the National Council for Civil Liberties, which is now Liberty, and they were respectable. I just want to show a quote from a book from around that time. There were many books published that were pro-paedophilia with all of the arguments and so on. This book, I want to show you a quote from, was called, in 1982, Flaunting It, a Decade of Gay Journalism from the Body Politic. And this was published in Vancouver. It's perfectly okay to publish these books. And this is a paedophile writing in the book. The youngest, 7, I think. He wasn't a very bright little fellow, but he just loved sucking. He used to come up to the apartment, and as soon as he got in, he'd say, "I want some wine." That meant he wanted to suck me off. He'd suck me to orgasm and swallow it. Now, I think that probably wouldn't be okay today to publish that sort of thing, but there were many books with this sort of material at the time because it was just so socially acceptable. I think Liberty would be worried about supporting one of these groups today, but some of the groups still exist, like NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association in America, that still exists. There's more and more groups online, it has to be said, and they keep getting closed down, and then there are more. But paedophilia has certainly not gone away. Paedophilia, we need to understand, is a euphemism. What we're really talking about is child sexual abuse, because there's no love in what these men do to children, as you can see with the man using the child to fellate him. What's happened in between is that the child sex abusers have been working away behind the scenes, including some of those who were active back in the 1970s. There are still some of the same names. They work to get legal systems, criminologists, sexologists to accept that they really love children and they don't want to touch them. They are, they say, non-contact pedophiles. And they say they need to be tolerated because guilt will make them offend. So if we don't tolerate them, they will rape the children. And it's a strange logic, but that's what they say. They want to be able to use child sex dolls and their fantasies. They want to be destigmatized because they say their desire to use children is innate and they cannot help it. And many academic articles, mostly by women, unfortunately, criminologists, for instance, make these arguments for them today. They have changed the nomenclature, and they are now called minor attracted persons, or MAPs. And I write about all of this in Penile Imperialism. It is depressing that men such as Tom Carroll from PI, Paedophile Information Exchange, are still out there. They're still writing articles, published in academic journals, justifying their practice. So for more of that, you'll have to wait for the next book.
I look forward to it, yes. And they also treat pedophilia as it was an innate sexual orientation, and we need to be comprehensive to them. And Sheila, when you study the sexologists from the 1950s, you underscore how they saw orgasm as a means to obtaining women's submission. In the 1960s and 1970s, the sexologists were still looking to warrant male sex rights, but they were not so blunt as those from the 50s. One of the strategies was speaking as though they cared about women's pleasure, not only men's, and also feminists, when underscoring the importance of the clitoris, for example, advocate for it, for women's pleasure, orgasm. So it seems as though orgasm was important to achieve women's submission, But nonetheless, we feminists, in as much as we are not anti-sex, as they call us, value women's pleasure, our pleasure, and see orgasms as a good thing. But is there some theoretical tension here, perhaps?
I'd just like to take this opportunity to give a couple of examples of the way that women were trained into heterosexuality and the importance of the orgasm and forcing them to have orgasms to their oppression in the 50s and 60s, if I may. Partly because they are so extraordinarily funny, because as you say, they were much more blatant in those days, but also just as an example of the training, there's huge numbers of sexologists, sex advice, literature, sex therapy, and so on, trying to force women to do PIV sex and to have orgasms at the time. They were very, very, very worried about it. This is the 50s and 60s. And this is a book by the wonderful title, The Sexually Adequate Female. Can you imagine a man just writing a book that he thought would explain to women what was sexually adequate and how they needed to be? And he's talking about the clients who come to him complaining that their wives do not want to do sex or not the right thing. And he says, other women make the serious mistake of engaging in distracting activities during the sex act. One husband complained that his wife was so unresponsive that she continued reading her book while he had intercourse with her. Another told me his wife kept on applying nail varnish to her fingernails during the sex act, rather than be interrupted in what she was doing, should say she here. These bedroom mistakes sound fantastic, but psychiatrists are not surprised to hear the many ways in which some wives manifest their frigidity or indifference to sexual lovemaking. I just absolutely love that, because we've got these wonderfully resistant women showing how much they hate what the man is doing. They can't not do it, but they can jolly well show how much, and they hate it. And their balletic abilities of being able to put on the nail varnish, I love that stuff. Anyway, there were a lot of women who were very resistant, so the sexologists had a very hard time. I'd love to have these sort of quotes from now, but because I'm sure it's all still going on, women's resistance. This is a quote from a book called Virgin Wives, A Study of Unconsummated Marriages, 1962. So you can really get a sense of what the sexual revolution was really about from reading this stuff. Unconsummated marriages were a problem because women were able to resist and not accept male power. And this is a woman saying, Mrs. Lowe replied, oh, I couldn't. She'd seen a little boy's penis that was soft and sweet, but don't ask me to talk about my husband's. I shall be sick if I do. At this point, the patient retched quite a lot, and the doctor did not pursue the topic further. Well, why on earth should she have to have anything to do with penises if she feels like that about them? And another piece of wonderful advice given at the time was that women had to be very enthusiastic about being penetrated, but they mustn't be too enthusiastic about being penetrated, because if they were, the penis might drop out, and then the man wouldn't know how to put it back in. He'd be interrupted and wouldn't know what to do. It's marvelous stuff, because the advice is so sort of nitty gritty, and they're trying to force a generation of women to be appreciative of the penis and have orgasms to it and to their subordination in a way that they didn't wish to do. So feminists are, of course, constantly accused then and now of being anti-sex, because we are determined to change the way that sex is constructed. And pursuit of orgasms at any cost, which has been promoted by the sex industry and therapy, may lead women to have to prioritize masochism and men to prioritize violence against women, because orgasms are political. It's crucial to reconstruct male and female sexuality so that equality is sexy. Otherwise, women can't pursue liberation because it would destroy their sexual response. Also, it's important to say that if women wish to pursue other hobbies that are not about sex, they should be able to do so. They should be able to do the gardening, read a book, and do anything that they like. The forced eroticizing of women is a big problem. And many women in relationships with men are extremely resistant to having to be penetrated or engage in sex at all. And that's especially the case in older women who are now under huge pressure to service men, especially those using Viagra, till their dying day, even though it is often very painful. And I've got a whole chapter about this in Penile Imperialism, about how women are being forced to do this right now.
This is a terrible but illuminating example. And the other ones are hilarious. Thank you for bringing them here. Sheila, it strikes me as though a central motive behind all of your writings is an ethical one. Nevertheless, I don't remember seeing this word frequently mentioned in your books. Do you agree with me and see your work as forming part of a broad feminist ethics?
Well, that is an interesting question. I've always preferred the word politics to that of ethics because I'm an atheist and I've been keen to avoid anything that could be seen as moralism all my life. But of course, all politics is actually based upon ethics. You know, one could say it's ethical to say that people should not be poor and people should not be oppressed. That's completely reasonable. But in the 1980s and 90s, feminist philosophers and theorists did create the basis of a feminist and lesbian ethics, looking at the way women treat each other, for instance. I don't think they used the term ethics for issues such as violence against women and so on, because, for instance, because that's so clearly about oppression. I write about that in the Lesbian Revolution, my 2018 book, in fact, about lesbian philosophy, lesbian ethics, and so on. But yes, my work could easily be seen as being about ethics because it's concerned with how sex is constructed and acted out. But I'm concerned with the political effects of that and not some abstract ideal. And often ethics is seen as being about some abstract ideal.
Okay, yes. Your answer to sexual politics is a feminist politics, which is ethical, but not in a moralistic nor in a religious sense. Thank you for your answer. And the Lesbian Revolution is one of the very few books of yours which I haven't read, so I will read it soon. You have said in other books that the way out of the subordination of women is eroticizing equality. And as amazing as it seems, there are not many examples of it in our culture. It might even seem as something unthinkable, so enmeshed are we in this domination and subordination dynamics. Could you give some concrete examples as to how the eroticization of equality looks like in real life?
Yes, what's interesting is that back in the day when we used to criticize the pornography industry and when I used to talk about eroticizing equality, sometimes it would be said to us, why don't you create the feminist porn? Why don't you do something that will show us? And of course, we couldn't possibly do that because we didn't want to objectify and sexually exploit women and so on, and they prostitute women, in fact, which is what it would require. So we were unable to do that, and would certainly be unable to do that. You can't, out of prostituting women, create any kind of equality, of course. So it's hard to sort of provide examples, but one example of how I would sometimes frame it with students is, I would say to my female students, that there's a difference between what might be called the erotic and the dysrotic. At the time, we tried to think of a word that would mean the opposite of what should be erotic. And dysrotic, D-Y-S-R-O-T-I-C is what we came up with. And the dysrotic is a kind of sexual response that is undermining to women. It's a response shaped by women's subordination, and it's about being excited by your own oppression. The sort of fantasy or dream that you feel that was exciting at the time, but leaves you feeling disturbed and uncomfortable, such as rape and sadomasochist fantasies, for instance. And being aroused in this way can conflict with how you want to be in the world and the world that you want. It's hard to form pornography, to fight pornography, for instance, if you're turned on by it. The erotic, which I understand to be about eroticizing equality, should make a woman feel energized in her feminist struggle. It's positive, and that's something completely different. And we did in the early 1980s, and I have discussed this in other books, when sadomasochism started at a movement and we were being told all women are masochists rather at heart, we did have workshops in which women would talk about ridiculous sexual fantasies or laugh at them. And therefore defang them. If you laugh at sexual fantasies, the excitement just goes. right? So we were talking to women how to transform the contents of their heads. So we were acknowledging that, of course, women do have these fantasies, but we need to change our sexuality. And I think many women were very successful in doing that.
Amazing that they thought porn would be the way to show the eroticizing of equality. That has no sense at all. No, and of course, when I asked you for an example, I wasn't thinking about some practical ways of eroticizing equality on the bedroom. No, I was thinking that maybe part of the task of eroticizing equality would need some kind of publicity. When the horrible and pervasive examples of sexual objectification of women are gone for good, what will be there instead? But now, listening to you, I realize we won't meet anything in their place. If nowadays women, as you say in the book, are trained to eroticize their subordination, after the feminist revolution, they will need no training. They will have their freedom instead, a sexuality of their own desires, free from external influences and pressures and all that. And as you say in the book, the course of eroticizing equality and mutuality has received no prizes from male supremacy or its agents, but it is time we shared our wisdom and experience, learned from feminists and lesbians in our history, and became proud of what distinguishes lesbian experience from male supremacist culture. Well, I have another question for you, Sheila. The women libertarians, or as Andrea Dworkin calls them, the collaborationists, those so-called feminists who defend pornography, who defended pornography back then, who confused sexual revolution with women's liberation, were there since the late 80s. You saw parallelisms between them and the male sexologists who attacked feminists in the beginning of the 20th century. 40 years later, a new generation of libertarians are using the same kind of distorted interpretations of radical feminism, lies, fallacies, and name-calling to attack radical feminists. The similarities between the old ones and the new ones are striking. Would you like to talk about those similarities and maybe mention possible differences between them?
Yes, thank you, Laura. In the book, I've got a large section on what I call the sexual libertarian feminists who fought against radical and lesbian feminists like me, who were trying to create a sexuality of equality. And basically they said that sex is inevitably about dominance and submission. That's what gives it the excitement. That's what gives it the power. You can't avoid that. And because it concerned their sexuality and their fantasies, they were furious with us. And they called us anti-sex. They promoted sadomasochism, pornography, prostitution, and they hurled abuse at us, saying we were right-wing, Victorian, anti-sex, and much, much more. They formed organizations to defend pornography from our attack, all in the name of being for free speech and anti-censorship, such as the Feminist Anti-Censorship Task Force in the US, a similar organization in Britain. And I think it is worth looking in more detail at some of the things that they said, partly because I think it does show some similarities with now, and shows what we were up against. This is the force of sexual libertarianism that destroyed our campaign against pornography and to create sexual equality, eroticized equality. This is Paula Webster. She was an anthropologist. She may still be alive, but she was an anthropologist at this time, very much involved in feminist theory and so on. And she wrote an article called Pornography and Pleasure, about how we should be taking pleasure out of pornography. And she said, it is true that this depiction is created by men, but perhaps it can encourage us to think of what our own imaginings and images might be. I mean, extraordinary to say that, particularly when you think what pornography is about now. I mean, maybe she wouldn't say it now, but she probably would. which is women being covered in semen and ejaculate from 250 men at the same time, which is women being strangled, and so on. Maybe she would still think this can encourage us to think about our own images and imagining. So we were being told porn was really good for us. This is Anne Snitow, editor of the book on Power of Desire, which was a collection of papers by sexual libertarians in the US in 1984. She said, our movement began to be frightened by what it had brought to light. So, women like me were frightened. Visibility created new consciousness. We were seeing the porn, you see, we were seeing it, but also new fear and new forms of old sexual terrors. Sexual harassment was suddenly everywhere. Rape was an epidemic. Pornography was a violent polemic against women. It was almost as if by naming the sexual crimes, by ending female denial, we frightened ourselves more than anyone else. You can see how furious we were. There were so many of us fighting porn at this time, and this is how we were described. We were just frightened. We were sort of Victorian, silly little girls who were frightened by pornography. But pornography, yes, did show us what male sexuality was like. It did show us a great deal about male supremacy. This is a piece by Esther Newton and Shirley Walton. Esther Newton was a lesbian writer of significance at the time, particularly she promoted butch femme. I don't know where she is now. Lesbian feminism and political lesbianism were born, and invented a sexual Iron Maiden with which every dedicated feminist has had to live. So that is what we did. As lesbian feminists and political lesbians, we created an Iron Maiden. I mean, the language is extraordinary. This is Gail Rubin, who was the most famous theorist of sadomasochism, lesbian so-called sadomasochism. She says, feminist theorists are like Victorian missionaries in Polynesia. And a perfect example of this is the debate over transsexuality. Isn't that interesting that transsexuality was significant even at that time? She says, feminism is the theory of gender oppression. To automatically assume that this makes it the theory of sexual oppression is to fail to distinguish between gender on the one hand and erotic desire on the other. So she said, feminists shouldn't be looking at sex. That's for gay men, basically, to look at, and because they're the experts, they do the sex stuff. Feminists shouldn't do that. We should just stick to something called our own oppression, which is nothing to do with sex. In other words, sex is not political in any way, is basically what she was saying. She says, feminist thought simply lacks the angles of vision which can encompass the social organization of sexuality. So we're blinkered, we can't understand sex, not like gay men can, and sadomasochists can. And she calls the sexual abuse of children cross-generational sex. Of course she does, and much more about her in the next book, because she was the one who said all the fetishes and sexual perversions had to be liberated, which of course is what's happening now. Today, the situation is a bit different, of course, because the feminist critique of sadomasochism and porn has mostly been buried. But there's still a very vigorous opposition to the radical feminist project of creating a sexuality of equality and transforming male and female sexuality. So there's much opposition, even within feminist circles, to the idea that sex can be changed at all right now. And indeed, nobody is talking to it. There are many, for instance, who think that heterosexuality and lesbianism are biological and may even make an argument that role-playing and butchness are somehow biological for lesbians. That's all going on right now, and no progress has been made there. The accusation now is that rather than being Victorian, we're harking back to another ridiculous period of history, which was called the Women's and Lesbian Liberation Movement, when women believed in changing sex and creating a sexuality of equality. They accuse us of being unreasonable women's liberationists, very old-fashioned. And there are, of course, different problems now. Though the libertarians of the 80s promoted what they called transsexualism, these transsexuals at that time were a tiny number and they had very little effect. Today, support for queer and transgender ideology has created a massive gulf among feminists. Sexual libertarians have morphed into biological sex libertarians who argue that sex means nothing. Anyone can be any sex or gender. And it's old-fashioned to speak of women or lesbians. I do think it's a development of the old problem, an inability to contemplate that sexuality can be political, and it needs to be transformed to enable the liberation of women. What do you think? Do you think there are any similarities with what's happening now?
Yes, of course. I'm sure if you only change the names and concrete examples, everything you say in Anticlimax about those libertarians is true of contemporary pseudo-feminists who right now are defending gender identity laws, the transgendering of children, surrogacy. And those women to whom Andrea Dworkin refers to when she says, as you quote in Anticlimax, whoever they are, whatever they think they are doing, the outstanding fact about them is that they are ignoring the women who have been hurt in order to help the pimps who do the hurting. They are collaborators, not feminists. And there seem to be many more of them now than 30 years ago, and they are everywhere. I just can't understand how dare they say they are against violence against women when they are giving a helping hand to the male supremacy. Well, Sheila, another question. We still have a little time. At some point in Anticlimax, you allude to the myth that sexual problems and incompatibilities existed because of the impact of Victorian morality. Could you please explain in what sense it is not true, it is a myth?
Yes. In Anticlimax, I explain that female sexuality is created in the context of the power difference between men and women. So little girls don't have power to eroticize because they do not have power. They don't have equality to eroticize because they don't have equality. They're going to be forced into sex stereotypes and have to wear skirts and have long hair and all that for a very, very early age. So little girls are created in a way which makes it impossible for them to have a sexuality which is not about masochism, at least to a large part. And in the book, I talk about, I have this quote where I say, to clarify the dilemma women have about sexual enthusiasm for men, it should be contrasted with men's situation. So women aren't just sort of old-fashioned and Victorian. There are very, very good reasons why they don't have enthusiasm for sex with men at all, or certainly of the kind that men want. And I say it's unlikely in the extreme that men will have experienced actual sexual violence from women or its threat, whereas of course many girls and women have. And the extraordinary thing is that women and girls in this context are expected to relate to the class of persons who are their oppressors and their abusers. You know, how is that possible? Men don't live in cultures where the degradation and brutalization of men at the hands of women is the stuff of pornography, entertainment, and advertising. That is the context in which women are supposed to enjoy sex with men. Men don't live with the consciousness that they're being hunted by women who would take sexual delight in dismembering them simply on account of their gender. And indeed, you know, men do not, women do. We know that we can walk down the street and some man might grab and murder us. So what is this going to do to the way women feel about sex? They do not live in a society in which their degradation through sex is the dominant theme of the culture, as it is. If we just watch anything on the television, it is the dominant theme. They do not have to approach women sexually in fear with distressing images or associations with their own oppression, but women have probably seen sexist advertising, may even have seen pornography. Those images are with them. The images they're like to carry with them are those of women degraded and brutalized by men. In fact, they're likely to have practiced sexual arousal with such images extensively through pornography and fantasy. So pornography creates for men the ideas they have around sex and how they feel. It's not surprising then that sexologists have identified women's inhibition as the main sexual problem of this century. What they've identified as healthy sexual feelings are those which the male ruling class experiences, and they've chosen to avoid recognizing the political reasons why women might feel differently. And the terrible thing is that we even have some feminists calling us anti-sex, not recognizing that sex is political, not recognizing what constructs sex for women.
I wonder if they read Anticlimax, for example, or other books by you, and really try to understand it. It is not difficult if you have an open mind and want to know what the person who wrote that was thinking and is trying to convey it. It should not be difficult. But would they still think sex is not political after seeing all these examples you give? Well, I don't know. But we are arriving to the end of this webinar, but maybe you have time to answer this question, this last question, Sheila. In the end of the book, you offer some hope and state the conditions for a real liberation of women. Would you like to explain them to those who haven't read it?
Yes, we don't have very much time, that's true. But what I say at the end of the book is a little bit more complicated, perhaps for a couple of minutes to explain, is that it's called Creating the Sexual Future. And I say that what we need to do is eroticize sexual equality, because otherwise there cannot be a future for women of liberation. It's not possible to have liberation if it's the subordination of women that gives the whole fun and excitement of what sex is to men and obviously to women too. So it's not possible to liberate women if it means the end of sex. So obviously the sexuality has to be eroticized. I use language at the end of the book, which is probably quite difficult to explain in a couple of minutes. But what I do is I say that what we need to work towards is homosexual desire. And by homosexual desire, I mean homo meaning same, meaning no difference of power, same power, which in theory is what takes place in homosexuality and in lesbianism. One of the reasons perhaps why often gay men and some lesbians reintroduce the power difference by introducing things like sadomasochism, pedophilia, and so on, because sex is constructed around power difference under male domination. So I argue that the problem is heterosexual desire, which is the eroticizing of the power differences between men and women, and which can also be carried out in the relationships of lesbians and gay men too. So what we need to get rid of is heterosexual desire. The reason I used those terms was I wanted to sort of promote the idea of homosexual desire as something really positive at that time. I'm not sure I go into that bother with the language now. But heterosexual desire, of course, is the normal eroticizing of power difference in heterosexual relationships. And before somebody says, well, that's not really true, that's not really true, just think about how the way men and women are dressed. And, women have naked parts of their bodies, like legs that are shaved. They've got the long hair and the makeup, and parts of their bodies are naked. I mean, just think about the tennis players right now at Wimbledon. Almost none of them wear shorts. They're not really allowed to, I guess. They're lovely, big, strong, wonderful women. And they're wearing little sort of frills over knickers. You can see the knickers all the time. And they, of course, have to shave. And of course, they have bare arms as well. They have to show as much of their bodies as possible. They have to put their balls in little pockets in their knickers so that men can see their knickers while they're doing it. Now, this is the basis of heterosexual desire. Until we actually create a world in which women can just wear shorts, training shoes, don't have to shave, wear makeup, can have short hair, can have dignity, it's not possible to imagine the eroticizing of equality or any kind of liberation for women. But those things are fundamental to heterosexuality. And in most heterosexual relationships, the women will have to dress to show their subordination to men in all of these ways. Tiny girls, and it enormously distresses me, have long hair. Why? Skirts so that you can show their knickers when they're struggling around on the seat in the cafe or whatever, and little shoes with glitter on. It's very terrible, but that is the basis of the eroticizing of subordination that is sex in this society. Till we get rid of that, the problem cannot really be dealt with. So yes, we need to get rid of heterosexual desire. As to heterosexuality as a political institution, we need to get rid of that too, so that in the future it might be possible that men and women will relate to each other, but they might potentially relate to each other in a way that is about equality. I know it's very difficult to imagine this now, but I do not rule out the possibility that this can happen, but they need to be doing it in the form of homosexual desire.
Thank you very much, Sheila. It's been an hour now, so we have to end this, but it's always a pleasure listening to you. Thank you very much for this opportunity of commenting Anticlimax. So, and thanks everyone who joined us today. So,
yes. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Laura.
you're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.